I could tell you about another celebrity chef opening their 100th restaurant, but what if I told you that the most important culinary story of the year happened in a tiny kitchen most people walk past without a second glance? What if I told you that a chef working double shifts for minimum wage just brought one of the most prestigious dining establishments in the country to its knees? And what if I told you that it all started with a single bowl of soup that nobody believed could change everything? My name is Rebecca Thompson, and 3 months ago I was washing dishes in the back of Romano's fine dining, watching plates worth more than my monthly rent get scraped into the garbage. Today, I'm the chef who made Michelin inspectors question everything they thought they knew about fine dining. But this story isn't just about food. It's about what happens when the culinary world's biggest gatekeepers realize they've been looking in all the wrong places. The morning that changed my life started like every other morning at Romano's. I arrived at 5 a.m. to prep vegetables that would be turned into dishes I'd never be allowed to make. I'd been working there for 2 years, watching Chef Benedict Romano bark orders at his line cooks while I stayed invisible in the dish pit. Benedict was one of those chefs who wore his anger like a badge of honor, screaming at anyone who dared suggest his vision wasn't perfect. He'd been chasing a Michelin star for 15 years, convinced that more foam and fancier plating would finally get him the recognition he deserved. What he didn't know was that 3 anonymous Michelin inspectors had been dining at Romano's for the past month, and they were thoroughly unimpressed. I only found out because I overheard him on the phone with his business partner, practically begging for another month before they pulled their investment. That morning, as I scrubbed sauce off plates that cost more than my grocery budget, I noticed something that would change everything. The walk-in cooler had broken down overnight, and most of the expensive ingredients Benedict relied on had spoiled. Wagyu beef, truffle oil, imported cheeses, all of it ruined. Benedict was having a complete meltdown, screaming at the repair technician while his sous chef stood around looking helpless. Here's what you need to understand about Romano's fine dining. It was all smoke and mirrors. Beautiful plates, pretentious descriptions, astronomical prices, but the food was mediocre at best. Benedict had convinced himself that expensive ingredients could mask his lack of actual culinary skill. I'd watched him serve undercooked pasta with caviar and call it innovation. I'd seen him charge $60 for a piece of chicken that was dry enough to use as kindling. But I'd also been quietly perfecting my own recipes during my break times, using the scraps and leftovers that Benedict considered garbage. While he was creating dishes that looked like abstract art but tasted like disappointment, I was making food that actually nourished people. Food that told stories. Food that reminded you why you fell in love with eating in the first place. That morning, with half his menu unavailable and a dining room full of reservations, including, unknown to us, 3 very important inspectors, Benedict was facing his worst nightmare. I watched him pace around the kitchen, muttering about calling in sick, about closing for the day, about anything that would save him from having to actually cook with the basic ingredients we had left. That's when I made a decision that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I walked up to Benedict Romano, the man who'd spent 2 years treating me like I was invisible, and I said something that would echo through the culinary world for months to come. I said, "Chef, let me cook today." The silence in that kitchen was deafening. Benedict stared at me like I'd suggested we burn the place down. His sous chefs looked confused, probably wondering who this dishwasher thought she was. But here's the thing about desperate people. They'll consider options they'd never normally entertain. Benedict looked at me, then at the empty walk-in cooler, then at the clock showing 2 hours until service, and something shifted in his face. It wasn't respect, not yet, but it was the recognition that he was out of choices. "You have 30 minutes to show me what you can do," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension I'd grown used to. "If you waste my time, you're fired." I nodded and walked to the prep station, my hands surprisingly steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every night when I'd go home and practice knife cuts until my fingers bled, every weekend when I'd experiment with flavor combinations in my tiny apartment kitchen, every moment I'd spent studying the masters while Benedict dismissed me as just another piece of kitchen equipment. What I was about to create wasn't revolutionary in the way the culinary world usually defines it. There were no molecular gastronomy techniques, No ingredients flown in from remote corners of the earth, no presentations that required engineering degrees to execute. What I was about to make was something that had been forgotten in restaurants like Romano's. Honest food made with love, skill, and respect for the ingredients. I started with what we had left: onions that were starting to soften, carrots with a few blemishes, celery that Benedict would have thrown away because it wasn't picture perfect, chicken bones from yesterday's service that were destined for the garbage, basic herbs from our struggling garden outside. Ingredients that cost less than the wine Benedict served by the glass. But here's what I knew that Benedict didn't. The difference between good food and great food isn't the price of your ingredients. It's understanding how to coax flavor from whatever you have, how to build layers of taste that tell a story, how to create something that doesn't just fill stomachs but feeds souls. I started by making a stock, the foundation of everything that would follow. While Benedict watched impatiently, probably calculating how much money he was losing every minute, I roasted those imperfect vegetables until they caramelized, releasing sugars that would add depth to my soup. I added the chicken bones and let everything simmer, filling the kitchen with an aroma that made everyone stop what they were doing and pay attention. 20 minutes in, Benedict's expression had changed from condescending impatience to curious confusion. The other cooks had gathered around my station, drawn by smells that Romano's kitchen hadn't produced in years. Real food smells. Honest smells. Smells that reminded you why you wanted to cook in the first place. While my stock simmered, I worked on the components that would make this dish sing. I made fresh pasta by hand, something Benedict had stopped doing years ago, in favor of expensive imported versions that looked better in photos but lacked the texture and flavor of handmade noodles. I prepared a simple but perfect sofrito, the holy trinity of onions, carrots, and celery that forms the base of countless classic dishes. I picked herbs from our neglected garden, washing them carefully and treating them with the respect that good ingredients deserve. As the 30-minute mark approached, I assembled my dish. It wasn't fancy. It wouldn't photograph well for Instagram. It didn't have a pretentious name or a story about rare ingredients sourced from mystical locations. It was simply this: fresh handmade pasta in a rich, golden chicken broth, with vegetables that had been cooked until they surrendered all their sweetness, finished with fresh herbs and a touch of good Parmesan cheese. A bowl of soup that would have cost $8 at a neighborhood Italian restaurant. When I set the bowl in front of Benedict, I could see him struggling to maintain his skeptical facade. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't molecular gastronomy or fusion cuisine or any of the trends he'd been chasing for years. This was just soup. Simple, honest, perfect soup. He picked up the spoon with the same expression someone might wear when handling evidence at a crime scene. Took a small taste. Paused. Took another. Larger spoonful. The change in his face was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was like watching someone remember something they'd forgotten they loved. The skepticism melted away, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. He finished the entire bowl without saying a word, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Not condescension, not dismissal. Something approaching respect. "Make 50 bowls of this for lunch service," he said quietly. "And Rebecca," he added, using my name for the first time in 2 years, "you're not washing dishes today." What happened next would become the stuff of restaurant legend, though at the time, I was too focused on execution to realize I was making history. Service that day was unlike anything Romano's had ever experienced. Instead of Benedict's usual parade of overcomplicated dishes that left diners confused and unsatisfied, we served my soup alongside simple preparations that let ingredients speak for themselves. Instead of the usual complaints and half-empty plates being returned to the kitchen, servers were coming back with reports of customers asking for seconds, for the recipe, for the name of whoever had cooked their meal. But the real validation came from table 7. 3 diners who'd been eating in relative silence, taking careful notes between bites. They'd ordered my soup almost as an afterthought, probably expecting the usual overpriced disappointment that Romano's was known for. Instead, they received something that made them put down their phones, stop their conversation, and actually pay attention to what they were eating. I watched through the kitchen's pass as they consumed every drop, as they called the server over not to complain but to compliment, as they ordered second bowls and ate those with the same focused attention. What I didn't know then was that I was watching three of the most influential food critics in the country discover something they'd been searching for without knowing it: authenticity in a world of culinary pretense. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday that started like any other, Benedict Romano got the phone call that every chef dreams of receiving. Michelin was awarding Romano's Fine Dining its first star. But here's where the story gets interesting, where David really faces Goliath, where the culinary establishment reveals its true colors. The Michelin Review, when it was published, praised Romano's for its return to classical techniques and honest flavors, specifically highlighting the extraordinary chicken soup that demonstrates how simplicity, when executed with skill and heart, transcends any amount of culinary showmanship. They called it a masterclass in restraint and technique, and the kind of dish that reminds us why we fell in love with food in the first place. Benedict, of course, accepted all the credit. In interviews with food magazines, he spun a story about his culinary evolution, his journey back to his roots, his decision to focus on fundamental techniques rather than flashy presentations. He never mentioned that the dish that earned him his Michelin star had been created by his former dishwasher. Never mentioned that the evolution they were praising had happened in 30 minutes while he stood there expecting to fire me. Never mentioned that I was the one who'd been quietly revolutionizing his kitchen while he chased trends and shouted at his staff. For 3 months, I watched Benedict build a career renaissance on the foundation of my work. I watched him give interviews about the importance of simplicity while continuing to serve overpriced, overcomplicated dishes on every other night. I watched him raise menu prices because of his new Michelin status, while paying me the same wages I'd earned as a dishwasher. I watched him hire a publicist and start planning a cookbook about his culinary philosophy, based entirely on techniques he'd learned from watching me work. But I also spent those 3 months documenting everything. Every recipe I'd developed, every technique I'd shared with the other cooks, every conversation where Benedict had dismissed my ideas before claiming them as his own. I kept detailed notes about the night of the Michelin visit, about the ingredients we'd used, about the desperate circumstances that had led to my moment of opportunity. I photographed the dishes I created, recorded the reactions they generated, and carefully built a case that would be impossible to dismiss. You see, while Benedict was busy taking credit for my work, I was preparing for war. The culinary world is built on a foundation of stories. Stories about passionate chefs, about family traditions, about the inspiration behind signature dishes. Benedict's story about his evolutionary soup was compelling, but it had one fatal flaw: it wasn't true. And in an industry where authenticity is supposedly prized above all else, being exposed as a fraud is a career-ending diagnosis. My opportunity for justice came sooner than I'd expected, in the form of James Morrison, a food journalist whose investigative pieces had exposed several high-profile restaurant scandals. James had been following the Romano's story, because something didn't quite add up. How does a chef known for molecular gastronomy suddenly create a dish that's the antithesis of everything he'd been cooking for 15 years? How does someone who'd been struggling for a decade suddenly find the secret to Michelin-worthy food overnight? James reached out to several current and former Romano's employees, and eventually, one of the line cooks who'd witnessed my 30-minute audition gave him my contact information. When James called, I made a decision that would change my life again. I told him everything. Not out of revenge, though I won't pretend that didn't play a part, but because the culinary world deserves to know where great food actually comes from. It deserves to celebrate the real creators, not just the people with enough privilege to put their names on restaurant signs. James spent 2 weeks verifying my story, interviewing other staff members, examining the timeline of events, and even bringing in handwriting experts to analyze my recipe notes. He was building a case that would be impossible for Benedict to deny or dismiss. The article, when it was published in Food and Wine magazine, was titled "The Real Chef Behind Romano's Michelin Star." It told the complete story of that morning, from the broken cooler to the desperate circumstances to my 30-minute audition that had changed everything. It included photographs of my original recipe notes, testimonials from other kitchen staff, and a detailed analysis of how my simple soup had fooled some of the most sophisticated palates in the culinary world. But the article didn't just expose Benedict's deception. It raised larger questions about the restaurant industry, about who gets credit for culinary innovation, about the invisible workers whose talent props up celebrity chefs, reputations. It asked why a dishwasher's revolutionary cooking had been dismissed until circumstances forced it into the spotlight. It challenged readers to consider how many other talented cooks are washing dishes, prepping vegetables, and working double shifts while their ideas get stolen by the people whose names appear on restaurant marquees. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the article's publication, Romano's reservation system crashed under the weight of cancellations. Food bloggers and journalists descended on the restaurants, demanding to speak with me, to taste the soup that had fooled Michelin, to understand how someone with no formal culinary training had created something that experienced critics called transformational. Benedict's response was predictably pathetic. He claimed I was a disgruntled employee seeking attention, that my story was fabricated, that anyone could make a simple soup, and I was trying to take credit for his years of hard work. But his protests sounded hollow, especially when other staff members started coming forward with their own stories of Benedict stealing ideas and claiming credit for others' innovations. The final nail in Benedict's coffin came from an unexpected source: the Michelin inspectors themselves. When contacted by Food and Wine for comment, they revealed something that made Benedict's situation even worse. They hadn't just been impressed by my soup on that one night. They'd returned to Romano's 6 more times over the following month, hoping to experience more of what they'd tasted. Instead, they'd been served Benedict's usual fare: overpriced, underwhelming dishes that confirmed their initial negative impression of the restaurant. It was only my soup, served on that single desperate night, that had earned Romano's its star. The inspectors were so disturbed by the revelation that they announced something unprecedented. They were conducting a formal review of Romano's Michelin star, with the possibility of revoking it based on the misrepresentation of authorship. In the history of Michelin ratings, stars had been lost due to declining food quality or restaurant closures, but never because of fraudulent claims about dish creation. Benedict Romano's career imploded within a week. His investors pulled their funding. His cookbook deal was canceled. Food Network dropped him from 2 planned television appearances. Most devastating of all, his own staff began quitting, sharing stories of his abusive behavior and credit theft that painted a picture of a kitchen ruled by fear and exploitation. Romano's fine dining closed permanently 3 weeks after the article's publication. But this story isn't really about Benedict Romano's downfall, satisfying as that might be. It's about what happened next, about how one bowl of soup became the catalyst for something much larger than any of us could have imagined. Within days of the article's publication, I was fielding calls from restaurant owners, food critics, and culinary schools across the country. Everyone wanted to know the same things. Who was I? Where had I learned to cook? What was my story? The answers, I realized, were both simpler and more complex than anyone expected. I was Rebecca Thompson, a 28-year-old woman who'd grown up in my grandmother's kitchen in a small town outside Denver. I'd learned to cook not from culinary school textbooks, but from watching my grandmother transform humble ingredients into meals that brought our entire extended family together every Sunday. I'd learned about flavor not from celebrity chefs on television, but from my mother, who could make magic with simple herbs and spices from her garden. I'd learned about hospitality not from restaurant management courses, but from growing up in a house where no one ever left the table hungry, where food was love made tangible, where cooking was both an act of service and an expression of creativity. My culinary education had happened in the margins of the industry that now wanted to celebrate me. I'd worked prep cook shifts at chain restaurants to pay for community college. I'd spent weekends catering church events and family reunions, learning how to cook for crowds while perfecting my understanding of how different flavors work together. I'd taken a job washing dishes at Romano's not because I lacked ambition, but because I needed steady income, while I figured out how to turn my passion for cooking into something that could support me. What the culinary world discovered in the weeks following the article's publication was that my story wasn't unique. Across the country, In dish pits and prep kitchens, behind the scenes of restaurants both humble and haute cuisine, there were dozens of talented cooks whose innovations were being credited to others. There were line cooks creating signature dishes that appeared on menus under their executive chefs' names. There were prep cooks developing sauce recipes that became restaurant signatures without any acknowledgement. There were dishwashers like me cooking revolutionary food during their break times while the people in charge dismissed their potential. The revelation sparked what food journalists started calling the Rebecca Thompson effect. Restaurants began publicly crediting their entire kitchen teams for dish development. Culinary schools started recruiting from community colleges and vocational programs instead of just privileging graduates from expensive four-year institutions. Food critics began paying attention to the stories behind dishes, not just the reputations of the chefs who claimed credit for them. But the most significant change was happening at the ground level of the industry itself. Kitchen workers who'd been invisible for decades were finding their voices, sharing their stories, and demanding recognition for their contributions to the restaurants that employed them. Social media became flooded with posts from cooks, sharing photos of dishes they'd created but never been credited for, stories of innovations that had been stolen by celebrity chefs, and calls for a more equitable system of recognition in professional kitchens. 3 months after the Food and Wine article changed my life, I found myself standing in an empty restaurant space in downtown Denver, holding keys that represented everything I'd dreamed of, but never dared to imagine. The space had been a failed tapas restaurant, then a brief-lived fusion experiment, then vacant for 8 months before I'd found it. It was nothing fancy. 40 seats, an open kitchen, exposed brick walls that had seen better days, and a dining room that would need significant work before it could welcome guests. But it was mine. The funding had come from an unexpected source, a group of investors who'd read my story and wanted to support what they saw as a new model for restaurant ownership. Instead of backing celebrity chefs with huge egos and questionable track records, they were interested in supporting working cooks with proven talent and authentic stories. They offered me not just financial backing, but creative control, profit sharing, and the kind of support that Benedict Romano had never received, because his investors had been betting on his manufactured reputation rather than his actual ability. My restaurant, which I named Rebecca's Table after the kitchen table where I'd learned to cook, opened 6 months later with a simple philosophy: honest food made by people who are honestly credited for creating it. Our menu featured the stories behind every dish. My soup, the one that had started everything, was listed as, quote, grandmother's chicken soup. Rebecca's interpretation of her grandmother's recipe, perfected during her time in the Romano's kitchen, and served here exactly as it appeared on the night that changed her life. But my soup was just one item among many that told the stories of our kitchen team. There was Michael's chili, a recipe he'd developed during his 15 years cooking in restaurants, where he was never allowed to put his ideas on the menu. There was Amanda's cornbread, a version of her family's recipe that had been refined through her work at 3 different Southern restaurants whose chefs had claimed credit for her innovations. There was Tyler's short rib preparation, a technique he'd invented while working at a steakhouse that had used his method for 2 years without ever acknowledging his contribution. Our kitchen operated on principles that were revolutionary only because the industry had strayed so far from basic decency. Everyone who contributed to a dish's development was credited. Kitchen staff received profit sharing based on their contributions to the restaurant's success. Ideas were discussed openly, with credit clearly established before implementation. New techniques were shared freely among the team, but their creators were always acknowledged. Most importantly, we treated cooking not as a competition where only one person could be celebrated, but as a collaborative art form where everyone's contributions made the final product better. The response from diners was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People weren't just coming for the food, though the food was exceptional. They were coming for the story, for the chance to support a restaurant that operated according to values they could believe in. They were coming to experience what happened when talented cooks were given the freedom and recognition to do their best work without fear of exploitation or theft. Food critics who visited Rebecca's Table wrote about more than just the quality of our dishes. They wrote about the energy in our dining room, the obvious pride of our kitchen staff, The way our model of shared credit and profit had created a restaurant experience that felt different from anything else in the industry. They wrote about how revolutionary it felt to eat food that came with honest stories about its creation, to support a restaurant where they knew their money was going to the people who had actually created their meal. 1 year after Romano's fine dining closed in disgrace, Rebecca's Table was featured on the cover of Bon Appetit magazine with the headline, "The Future of Restaurants is Here." The article detailed how our model of equitable kitchen management had inspired dozens of other restaurants to change their crediting practices, how our success had demonstrated that diners were hungry for authentic stories and ethical business practices, and how the conversation sparked by my simple soup had begun to reshape an entire industry. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when I received a letter from a young cook in Seattle who'd read about my story and been inspired to speak up about her own experiences with credit theft. She wrote about how she'd spent 3 years watching her executive chef claim credit for her pastry innovations, how she'd been afraid to speak up because she needed the job, and how reading about my experience had given her the courage to document her contributions and demand recognition. She'd confronted her chef, armed with photographs and written records of her recipe development. When he refused to acknowledge her work, she'd quit and used her documentation to secure funding for her own bakery, which had opened to rave reviews and a 3-month waiting list for wedding cakes. Her story was one of dozens I received from cooks across the country who'd found the courage to demand credit for their work, to leave exploitative situations, and to pursue their own visions of what the restaurant industry could become. My Simple Soup hadn't just exposed one chef's fraud. It had started a movement toward a more honest, more equitable, more sustainable way of creating and crediting food. As I write this, 2 years after that desperate morning in Romano's kitchen, Rebecca's Table is thriving beyond anything I could have imagined. We've been booked solid for 8 months. We've received offers to expand to other cities. Food Network has approached me about hosting my own cooking show, one that would focus on the stories of working cooks rather than celebrity chef personalities. I've signed a deal to write a cookbook that will feature not just recipes, but the stories of the people who created them. A collection of dishes from kitchen workers whose talents have been overlooked by an industry obsessed with individual stardom. But the most important change isn't in my personal success. It's in the emails I receive from young cooks who tell me they've found the courage to pursue their dreams, in the restaurants that have changed their crediting practices after reading about my experience, in the food critics who now ask different questions about the dishes they review. It's in the knowledge that my grandmother's soup, prepared with love and honesty in a moment of desperation, became the catalyst for a conversation about justice, recognition, and the true sources of culinary innovation. The restaurant industry still has a long way to go toward true equity. There are still celebrity chefs stealing ideas from their staff. There are still talented cooks washing dishes while less skilled people with more privilege claim credit for innovations they didn't create. There are still systems in place that favor self-promotion over actual cooking ability, marketing over authentic flavor development. But something has shifted. The conversation has changed. People are paying attention to the stories behind their food in ways they never did before. Diners are asking questions about who created their meal. Food critics are investigating the sources of signature dishes. Restaurant investors are looking beyond celebrity chefs to find the working cooks whose talents have been hidden by an industry built on individual mythology rather than collaborative truth. And in kitchens across the country, cooks who once worked in silence are finding their voices, sharing their stories, and demanding the recognition they've always deserved. My soup was simple: handmade pasta, rich broth, honest vegetables, and respect for ingredients that others might have dismissed as ordinary. But it carried within it something that the culinary world had forgotten in its pursuit of trends and celebrity: the transformative power of food made with skill, love, and authenticity. It reminded 3 Michelin inspectors, and eventually the entire industry, that the most revolutionary act in cooking isn't creating something no one has ever seen before. It's taking something familiar and preparing it so well, with such care and understanding, that it becomes transcendent. It's remembering that food, at its best, is about nourishment, connection, and the simple pleasure of eating something that was made by someone who cares about your experience of it. That morning in Romano's kitchen, When I stepped up to the stove with 30 minutes to prove myself, I wasn't trying to change the culinary world. I was just trying to cook the best soup I knew how to make. But sometimes, when you approach something with complete honesty and skill, when you stop trying to impress people and start trying to feed them, when you remember that cooking is an act of service rather than an exercise in ego, you create something that resonates far beyond your original intention. Sometimes a simple soup, made with love in a moment of desperation, can remind an entire industry of what it means to cook with integrity. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that soup can change everything.